replaceable in that? What about helium as well? Because that's needed in industrial processing. I wanted you to talk about those two elements, but if you look at the entire commodity space, whether it's rare earth elements, neodymium, terbium, whatever, neon, or are there a handful of those that you look at as being the most constrained in terms of future supply?
I'm not concerned about rare earths at all. That's a processing issue. And the ore that produces rare earth elements comes from almost every mine in the world as a byproduct. So it's just a question of building out the processing capacity. And once the Chinese started to try to blackmail the Japanese a few years ago, a lot of countries, the US included, built out some of that processing capacity. So if there ever was a shortage, we could kind of switch some gears and within a few months have a domestic supply. So I'm not concerned about that. It's like the one thing I'm not concerned about. Industrial gases are a messy space because every gas has its own economics, but all of them are sourced from something called an air separation unit, which just takes the atmosphere and splits it into different chunks. Most air separation is done for oxygen and nitrogen as part of steel foundries, and that's no exception when it comes to the former Soviet Union. The problem is it requires a second stage of separation in order to get the trace gases like helium and neon. And that second stage is usually done at a different facility that's more advanced. And in the case of the former Soviet Union, where 80% of the stuff comes from, that second stage was largely done in Mariupol, and all the infrastructure has been destroyed. For
Interesting.
those of you who don't know, helium and neon are the two critical components in semiconductor etching lasers. So we are going to have a massive global shortage in semiconductor fabrication capacity within a year.
Which means car manufacturing, among other things, will be much more constrained.
We're going to have to decide what goes back to analog for a while. It's going to take 2 to 3 years to build out replacement infrastructure somewhere else.
So Intel planning to build this multi-billion-dollar fab here in Taylor, Texas, just north of Austin, is going to be part of this reshoring in particular. But they're going to need these rare gas or these relatively rare industrial gases to make any of it work.
I need to pick that apart a little bit because it's yes-ish. Several companies, most notably Taiwanese ones, after the last scare we had with neon, which happened back in 2014 with the last Russia-Ukraine war, have invested a lot in recycling of the cartridges that have the neon and the helium, and they've made a degree of progress, and those recycling facilities are actually located in-house. So there are some technologies under development with this and different kinds of lasers to try to slim down the need. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. Intel's not reshoring. That's a fundamentally new technology that they're implementing at scale. And most of the high-end fab facilities that the Biden administration is encouraging fall into that category. The key to remember with semiconductors is there's different categories of quality. The high end that goes into servers and phones and computers, that was already done here, as well as in Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And so when we expand our footprint of this stuff, we're actually taking market share from allies. The low end, the Internet of Things, your smart light bulbs, that's all China.
Gotcha. So I want to, since you're talking about China, you're on YouTube. You have a very successful channel on YouTube. You're producing content all the time. I mean, you mentioned, by the way, when we met here in Austin, and I do a fair amount of public speaking. I had 40 engagements this year. You told me then you were doing 160 this year. Is that right? In calendar year?
Done like 15 since then.
But your total engagements this year will be 160 speaking engagements, something like that.
Oh no, I'm going to top 180.
180. So yeah. You've added 20
I'm
since
so
I saw
tired.
you. Okay, well, so that's the tee up for in this recent video about China. You were talking about Xi, and you said, and this issue of the information rate and a one-man rule, and you said, I'm quoting you here, you said, a person only has so much bandwidth. How do you have so much bandwidth? I mean, I'm staggered truly because I get tired of hearing myself talk, and I can imagine hearing myself say, the same, you're not saying the same thing 180 times, but to do anything that much, you have a speaking engagement every other day. How do you do it?
Well, I've got a great team supporting me, and if I ever implied that this was all me, that was not what I intended. I apologize.
No, I know.
And my job is to figure out how the world works and look at it through the eyes of everyone who is in front of me so I can explain to them the opportunities and the obstacles in front of them. I am not attempting to micromanage their business. There's a big difference between helping people see the world through a new angle and trying to micromanage a country of 1.2 billion people. One of these is an easier test than the other. And I have very open lines of information and communication to the world around me, whereas Xi has built a wall.
So, well, you mentioned your team. So, how many people do you have? Zeihan on Geopolitics is your firm. Is it an LLC? What kind of entity is it?
Most of us are involved in research in some way. There's only half a dozen of us total, but then we, of course, outsource for people for contract work that do very specific things like graphics and web support.
Gotcha. So, but I'm truly am impressed by your output. I mean, how do you have a photographic memory? I mean, like I mentioned the book, and I've seen you speak. I've heard you on podcasts. I mean, the command that you have, and I'm not blowing smoke up your skirt here, but the command that you have over the amount of information that you deal with and the amount of information that you turn around and make your own and then produce as content is, I mean, I've been to, as my father used to say, a county fair and a goat rope, and it's damn impressive. How do you do it?
Well, I've got two things going for me. First of all, I'm a generalist. So it's all about drawing connections among different things. And every time I'm in front of an audience, I'm learning the world from a new point of view. You do that 180 times in a year, you got a book. And that's where the last one came from, to be perfectly blunt. Second, I've identified the weak points in the international system years ago as part of my previous work. And so now that it's all happening, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can look at the work that we've already done in the past and say, okay, we identified these weak points. This one is in play right now, and that triggers these events. So from our point of view, the hard work is behind us.
So that's the way you keep it fresh by saying, oh, well, then I pull this out of the file cabinet, so to speak, and say, well, this is what matters now because this is what happened then.
And right? This is what you can look forward to happening next because the next domino to fall has to be here.
Right. But I asked that question seriously. Do you have a photographic memory?
No, but I would actually argue that right now I'm full. It's like I have to I'm Johnny Mnemonic now. Like every time I put something in, something else has to come out.
Well, okay, I would imagine. So are you reading? Well, so just a couple more questions here because we're close to an hour. So when you read books, of whoever, I mean, this is almost 500 pages. Are you reading other people's works and then digesting them and taking notes? How do you manage the inflow of information?
I used to. I have not had time this year. There has not been time. In the past, I was big on structure books or history books that studied overall trends, like Silk Roads was one of my favorites because it, talked about this concept of geography and how it played across the national politics and economics of countries going back 25 centuries. I loved that. I don't have time for that kind of stuff.
So, one of the questions I have guests introduce themselves, and then I always ask them toward the end of the interviews, what are you reading? Now, you mentioned Silk Roads. Who was the author of that?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask that. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head.
No problem. But so you said you don't have time. Or are you reading any books now, or what are you reading on a daily basis?
No, I have been on the road all but 7 of the last 95 days. So right now I'm not reading anything.
Gotcha. But if you were, and aside from then, well, let me just press you a little bit. So aside from your own books, The Accidental Superpower, this one, what books would you recommend besides your own to people who are interested in the geopolitical space? Are there favorites of yours?
Oh, well, I mean, the two obvious ones are Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, which remains the best example of how geography shapes economic development going back to the beginning of human recorded history. Great book. You're going to learn a lot about chickpeas, just be prepared. But the intersection of climate and geography and axial trade is kind of a hallmark, and that kind of sets the stage for what's possible. And if you're looking for something that's on the complete flip side, World War Z by Max Brooks, not the movie was hot trash, the book. And yes, it's about zombies. I am not a zombie fan. I am not a Romero fan, but he takes the entire human condition and changes one thing and shows how it remakes military strategy and technology and finance and agriculture and culture. And it's an amazing case study of what could happen.
Good. Well, those are, so is you mentioned Guns, Germs, and Steel. Did you use that as kind of a model for how you do things then? I mean, because it's the top of your list here. Is that kind of
anyone who is in my space and says no to that question is lying.
because he set the stage, well, gave the
He
template
set the
that.
stage for how it could be done, and the rest of us aren't copying. But wow, I don't think without his framework we would all be able to think about things in the way that we do.
So you stole the idea.
I like to think I'm paying homage.
There you go. Well, it was it Picasso or John Lennon. They're both given credit for this line. Amateurs borrow, professionals steal. So there you go.
Well, like I said, I'm not standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm standing on the shoulders of everyone.
Okay, so last question, Peter, and Peter Zeihan's work can you be found pretty much everywhere. He's the author most recently of "The End of the World is Just the Beginning: Mapping the Collapse of Globalization." I said I was going to give you one question, but I have to ask this one first because people ask me, "Are you writing another book now? Do you have another book in mind? You're awful busy to do anything besides
My publisher
standing
is
on
leaning on
stage."
me very hard. I'm starting to noodle over it. Ask me again in January because I haven't had time to really flesh it out. But I'm playing with a few ideas.
Gotcha. So the last question, then, Peter, what gives you hope? No one would accuse you of being overly optimistic. What's the Doctor Doom? The guy from NYU. His name is slipping my mind right now, but your outlook on the world has a lot of cautionary notes. What gives you hope?
Well, we are looking at the end of the globalized era, and that means unwinding a lot of the benefits of the globalized era. And there's nothing about that that's cheery. But we're not looking at a systemic collapse of human civilization here. I mean, we've had a number of periods in human history where when the system broke, everything broke. I mean, Europe had a millennium long dark ages. That's not what we're looking at here. The American system is going to hold, it's going to expand, it's going to thrive, and it's going to reach out and integrate with other parts of the world that are also going to do well. And they're going to be secondary centers around the world. Think of France, think of Turkey, that are also going to do pretty well for themselves. This is not a vacation from history. This is an adjustment period. Now, it's an adjustment period that's going to last 30 years. But on the other side of this, technology is going to continue to advance. And when we get through this adjustment, it's not that we're going to pick up where we left off, but we will enter the next chapter of history. This is not the end. This is just a really, really bad shakeout.
And it's not going to last forever.
No.
Was Nouriel Roubini, the Doctor Doom from NYU. He's known as Doctor Doom. And I'm not suggesting you're Doctor Doom, but